Hello everyone, thank you for joining me this evening. This is Symbolic Sorcery, and I am your host, Symbolic Sorcerer. This is our very special first episode of Symbolic Sorcery, and what we're going to be discussing tonight is some very basic ideas on symbolism, and then see how that relates to some more advanced and esoteric concepts that come up in things like tarot and Kabbalah and alchemy. So we're going to start from the very beginning and get some real basic ideas out and then kind of build off that. So that's kind of the plan for the discussion for tonight. So if you're listening to the show live tonight and you'd like to call in and you have a question about anything being discussed here, or you're simply interested and want to join in the discussion, then you can call the number that you see on the website and you will be able to join me tonight on the show. And so without further ado, let's get into the topic for tonight's discussion. So the show was titled How to Read the Esoteric Language of Symbols. And it's not really generally understood how symbols are supposed to be interpreted when we see them. There's sometimes hidden layers of meaning of symbols where we think a symbol means one thing, but to a more selective group of people, it has a deeper meaning. And that's concealed through the nature of symbols. So we're going to be discussing how we can understand symbolism as a language and how we can actually start to read this language, and why we actually need to if we're going to be working with consciousness and trying to develop spiritually. So the basic meanings on symbols, if we want to look at them, are a symbol is just some sort of thing that represents some other object or some other idea that the symbol stands for. So the symbol is used in place of some other idea. And we find this in all over the place in everyday life, where different little icons and figures are used on various buildings. Like when you go into a restroom, you see the icons to tell you, this is the men's room, this is the ladies' room, and everyone can tell what the symbols mean. And so they have a sort of a common or shared meaning. And so those are the ordinary symbols we meet with in everyday life. And so we can actually go on to make other categories of symbols, because this is a show devoted to mostly symbolism as it appears in occult and esoteric teachings, especially the tarot, the Kabbalah, alchemy, and sacred geometry. So if we go on and look at those things, we will be interested in what is meant by occult symbols and how these are different from common everyday symbols. And once we start to think symbolically by understanding occult symbols, then we can really see how symbolism and symbols are used all over the place in everyday life, and we really start to see that everything is some sort of symbol in some way or another, and that all consciousness is really built on symbols, and symbols are kind of the currency of consciousness, or the basic building blocks of different conscious levels. So what's going on with occult symbolism is that there is special meanings that go with these symbols that have to do with things that people don't ordinarily know or experience on their ordinary conscious level. But these symbols can be understood through experiences of higher states of consciousness, where the symbol almost becomes a download of this higher level of consciousness. So that's what we find in astrology symbols, like for the zodiacal signs and for the planets, that really these symbols have a special shape because there's a sort of language being presented there that if we understood what it's saying, then we could see that it's referring to a specific either state of consciousness or power or force of consciousness. So when you get into occult symbolism, the meanings aren't readily understood. It's something you kind of have to work your way into and understand through different kinds of study, different kinds of meditation, and other kinds of techniques you can use to start opening up to these experiences that's being referred to in these symbols. So common everyday symbols are referring to just everyday things in life. Like, just think of like the dollar sign. Everyone knows what that means. It just refers to money. But when we go on to occult symbols, the things being referred to are actually advanced states of consciousness, or forces and powers of consciousness. So that's what we're going to be mainly looking at on this show, is occult symbolism. We're going to be understanding how we can get into these areas of consciousness by studying these patterns, these symbol patterns that have been left down through the ages and that have collected deep wisdom teachings behind them. And of course I'm referring to tarot, Kabbalah, astrology, alchemy, and so on. So we're going to be starting from the ground up, looking at what's the real basic idea on how can we get into this occult symbolism worldview, and how can we use that to go on to these advanced teachings. So tonight's show is just going to be about basics on occult symbolism. So if we can go on here to talk a little bit more about occult symbolism specifically, it's really about how we can work with our consciousness. And so we know how we can work in the physical world. We have a physical body, and we can go out and have a job or build things and make things, or whatever it is we do with our physical body. We know how to work at that level and sort of transform the different things in our environment through action. But what's going on in occult symbolism is that we're doing a kind of work that's internal. And what is going on there internally is a kind of language, a kind of pattern. And when we start to understand this language and how it's the language of symbolism, then we can start to work on the level of our consciousness, and we can start to develop ourselves in all sorts of new areas, in new mental areas, or any type of spiritual abilities we might want to develop. Really, I think studying symbolism is the way to do this, because what we're doing is we're going in and we're understanding how our consciousness works through looking at the basic building blocks, and those are symbols. Now, there's also a third category of symbolism, and that is what's known as pure symbolism, or pure symbols. And these symbols don't have a meaning that people give to them or that refer to something else. They refer to themselves because they are pure patterns. And what these symbols are like pure mathematical geometric forms that have this absoluteness to them, where it really doesn't matter what kinds of meanings or interpretations people give to them. They still have these pure absolute meanings that correspond to mathematical absolutes. So this third category of symbolism is one that's not really well understood, and so we can get into that in later shows. That's more of an advanced topic, and really that is the field known today as sacred geometry. When I talk about sacred geometry, I'm really referring to pure symbolism. And this is the kind of symbolism that is more than the language of our own consciousness. This is really the language of nature. And so what we have to try to think of what language nature is using in order to preserve and manifest itself. And whenever we think about this, the wisest people that have ever thought about this have nailed it down to a few very basic things, and really they can all be related to each other mathematically. And so the pure symbols that are the language of nature are things like number, shape, tone, color, angle, and proportion. So these are some very special categories because these types of symbol have real absolute meanings. This is really how the world is built up, and this is how our consciousness is built up. So when we start to understand what these pure symbols are doing and how we can work with them, then we can really start to take on higher and higher levels of understanding of ourselves. And really, it's all just about knowing ourselves and know thyself. Okay, so going back to occult symbolism in particular, if we want to start learning about occult symbolism, there are a few basic things that we can start with. And it really goes back to some very ancient Cabalistic teachings that probably predate any kind of real, Hebrew type origin. These teachings are probably very, very old and may even go back to, the supposed Atlantis period. So, although that's, who knows about any of that, it really doesn't matter. What's important to us on this show is how we can use these teachings to understand some basic symbolism. So, in Kabbalah, the basic symbols are numbers, letters, and words. And so, if you're familiar with the Tree of Life in Kabbalah, you would know that there are 10 Sephiroth. And so these 10 Sephiroth represent 10 different aspects of manifestation. And there are also 22 paths on the Tree of Life that connect the various Sephiroth. And these 22 paths correspond to the 22 Hebrew letters. And that's sort of the way people understand this, is through the Tree of Life. But really we can take a step back to some more basic things without even getting into the Tree of Life, because the Tree of Life is such an advanced, such a deep and vast topic that, to really get into it just takes so many years, and it's just an incredible thing to work towards. But before we need to really even worry about that, we should focus our studies, our study on symbolism, starting from numbers, letters, and words, because this goes back to the very early Cabalistic documents, or Cabalistic texts, that are before, or sort of come before what we know today as the Tree of Life. And there are references in these books to, the Sephiroth, but there's no Tree of Life diagram or anything like what we know today as the Tree of Life being described in this book. And so, just to give you a good feel of what is meant by this study of symbolism, we can go back to these source Cabalistic books and use these sort of as stepping stones to how we should approach this way of looking at the world through symbolism. And so it goes back to a very old Cabalistic book known as the Sefer Yetzirah, and that translates as the Book of Formation. And no one really knows how old the book is. It's widely debated by scholars. But what I am trying to talk about tonight is the practical application of what's written in Sefer Yetzirah to understand how I am going to explain symbolism on this show. So I'd like to read tonight on the first show a portion of the Sefer Yetzirah. And this is sort of keeping in line with wanting to have live meditations on the show. So tonight, let's just have sort of a informal meditation on reading through the first chapter of the Sefer Yetzirah. In 32 mysterious paths of wisdom did the Lord write. He created his universe by 3 forms of expression: numbers, letters, and words. 10 ineffable Sephiroth, and 22 basal letters, 3 mothers, 7 double, and 12 simple. 10 ineffable Sephiroth, corresponding to the 10 fingers, 5 against 5, and the only token of the covenant in the middle, the word of the tongue, and the circumcision of the flesh. 10 ineffable Sephiroth, 10 and not 9, 10 and not 11. Understand with wisdom and apprehend with care. Examine by means of them and search them out. Know, count, and write. Put forth the subject in its light and place the formator on his throne. He is the only creator and the only formator, and no one exists but he. His attributes are 10 and have no limits. 10 ineffable Sephiroth. Their totality is 10. They are, however, without limits. The infinity of the beginning and the infinity of the end. The infinity of the good and the infinity of the evil. The infinity of the height and the infinity of the depth. The infinity of the east and the infinity of the west. The infinity of the north and the infinity of the south. 10 ineffable Sephiroth. Their appearance is like that of a flash of lightning. Their goal is infinite. His word is in them when they emanate and when they return. At his bidding do they haste like a whirlwind, and before his throne do they prostrate themselves. 10 ineffable Sephiroth. Their end is in their beginning, and likewise their beginning in their end, as the flame is bound to the burning coal. The Lord is one, and the formator is one, and hath no second. What number canst thou count before one? 10 ineffable Sephiroth. Close thy mouth, lest it speak, and thy heart, lest it think. And if thy mouth openeth for utterance, and thy heart turneth toward thought, bring them back. And therefore is it written, and the living creatures ran and returned, and hence the covenant was made. 10 ineffable Sephiroth. 1. The spirit of the living Elohim. His throne is erected in eternity. 2. Air from spirit. He wrote and formed therein 22 basal letters, 3 mothers, 7 double, and 12 simple. 3. Water from air. He wrote and formed therein 22 letters, from the formless and the void, mire and clay. He designed them as a plat-band. He hewed them as a wall. He covered them as a building. He poured snow over them, and it became earth. 4. Fire from water. And he designed and cut thereof the throne of glory, seraphim, ophanim, the holy animals, the ministering angels, and with these 3 he founded his dwelling. He chose 3 of the simple letters, a secret belonging to the 3 mothers, Aleph, Mem, Shin, and put them in his great name, and sealed with them 6 extensions. 5. He sealed the height, stretched upwards, and sealed it with Yod, He, Vav. 6. He sealed the depth, stretched downwards, and sealed it with Yod, Vav, He. 7. He sealed the east, stretched forwards, and sealed it with He, Yod, Vav. 8. He sealed the west and stretched backwards and sealed it with He, Vav, Yod. 9. He sealed the north, stretched to the left, and sealed it with Vav, Yod, He. 10. He sealed the south, stretched to the right, and sealed it with vav, he, yod. These are the 10 ineffable Sephiroth. 1. The spirit of the living Elohim. 2. Air from spirit. 3. Water from air. 4. Fire from water. Height, depth, east, west, north, and south. So that, my friends, is Chapter 1 of Sefer Yetzirah, and I'm sure you'll agree that it is a very obscure book. But from that very first chapter come forth so many teachings and patterns that appear in Kabbalah that it's real important to take a look at what's written there. Even if a lot of it isn't really understandable, a lot of it has some basic patterns and things that the rest of Kabbalah is built up off of. As you'll notice, it's a description of how the 10 Sephiroth came into being, which, from a very source and early Cabalistic book, that's a very important thing to go through. Now, the reason I wanted to go through that tonight is because it's talking about how the process of creation took place through these basic types of symbols, through numbers, letters, and words. We have these 10 Sephiroth, and these are these 10 basic qualities or aspects, and these are brought forth into being through these different commands and utterances, and through words and speaking, through kind of speaking them into existence. And any kind of words are, of course, going to have to be built up off of letters. And so numbers, letters, and words are the basic types of symbols. And we see this very clearly in the Sefer Yetzirah. So, with that said, there's really a lot more we could talk about with symbolism, and I have a pretty lengthy list of discussion topics for tonight that we're probably not going to get to all of them, but we'll be able to say a little bit about each of them. Just one last idea before I leave the topic on basic symbols is I wanted to say that really symbols themselves have no inherent meaning. Even really, so pure symbols do, but unless it's a pure symbol, then it really has no inherent meaning. And so remember, pure symbols are numbers, shapes, tones, colors, angles, and proportions, and so on. But common symbols and really occult symbols have no inherent meaning. They're just sort of the containers of meaning through the different associations that we form with the symbol. And what we can do to get into what's represented by an occult symbol. So remember, occult symbols refer to actual states of consciousness or powers of consciousness. That there are some very powerful symbols that act as doorways to accessing these levels of consciousness. And that is what we're going to talk about when we discuss the tarot a little bit later on. But that's just one thing that's really true for all occult symbols, not even necessarily tarot, that all occult symbols are supposed to serve as doorways to accessing these levels of consciousness where we can start to work with these thought forms and concepts that come through these levels and are shown and the different kinds of symbolism and what is associated with those. So there's the idea of symbols as doorways, and we're going to be talking a lot about that in future shows. Now, in terms of our own consciousness, we all have a kind of personal framework for symbols, and it's just everything that's sort of in our memory, that we have these basic building blocks in our consciousness or in our memory, and it's pretty much all built on symbols in one way or another. Like we have some memory of something that happened when we were a kid, maybe something that happened at school when we were young. Our teacher said something to us that we didn't like, and from then on we formed a negative association with teachers, and that has sort of been left behind in our consciousness, and we forgot about it. And we all have these sort of little patterns that that sometimes prevent us from receiving the kind of wisdom we might need to get from people, but because we have certain blockages that we don't open up to what people have to say because we don't like their type or something like that. So we have this personal framework of symbols that we use to sort of make our way through the world and communicate with everyone else. So the idea there is that we have this network of symbols, and it's like this giant web, like a big spider's web, or like like the internet web, the World Wide Web. And so each symbol is sort of like a point on this web, and symbols are all related to each other. So the different connections between symbols are like the little lines and strings in the network. And when we take on this worldview, we see that pretty much everything is part of this network of consciousness and symbols. And when we start to see things in this way, then we can start to try to use it to help ourselves, because understanding is only going to help us make our way through the world. Now, what I'm talking about here with the web or the network has a real specific name, and that's called the net. And there is a very esoteric tradition known as the Masters of the Net. And it goes all the way back to ancient Egypt, where the initiates of the Egyptian mysteries were called the Masters of the Net. And so the ancient Egyptians completely understood this symbolic consciousness and how everything in consciousness is symbolism. And you can see that perfectly in their writing, in their hieroglyphic writing. It's completely symbolism. So the Masters of the Net were the Egyptian sort of magicians who understood this this network of consciousness and symbolism, and they understood it from the even higher level of pure symbols, which we talked about before. Pure symbols are things like number, shape, tone, color, angle, and proportion. And so the Masters of the Net were able to control the forces of nature through their understanding of how to use this language. And so in this Masters of the Net tradition, the ancient Egyptian, what we today call gods and goddesses, were not called gods and goddesses. They were known as netter, or netters. And we get the word nature from that word netter, and that's N-E-T-E-R. And so, well, we can see what's being referred to there is the net. And so the netters and the masters of the net were all doing things with this language of pure symbols. And this is how the ancient Egyptian pyramids were built, and all the understanding behind what is represented there. So we have all this sacred geometry that we could look at in terms of symbolism, but the important thing is just to understand that we have this kind of net of symbols, and that's basically our consciousness. And really this show is about learning how to become like the masters of the net, because we're going to be learning about symbolism, and we're going to be learning how to understand this web of consciousness or symbolic associations, and how we can start to actually take control over what it looks like and how it's built and how it functions. And we can actually start to reconstruct it according to a divine plan. And that is the true alchemy of symbolism, is that we're trying to reconstruct our consciousness according to these symbolic patterns that have been left down for us, because we want to rebuild our net, our personal net, into a kind of divine plan or a divine pattern. And really when we understand what's going on here, why this is happening, it gets very interesting why we can understand it this way. And this is really the true meaning of what tarot and Kabbalah and alchemy and astrology are for, is that we are going to rebuild our consciousness based on these patterns, because these are the patterns of creation itself. So when we build these patterns into our net, then we can go with the flow of how this divine energy is working and be there along with it. Okay, so that's a big idea. Now, I have a lot to say about that, and a lot of what the show is going to be is filling in details on how you can do just that. And that is sort of the overall plan of the show, is to kind of describe this way of being initiated into the masters of the net through studying symbolism and meditating on symbolism, like I'm going to describe and show you how to do in this show. Now, I can't guarantee that every show is going to be so intense. I want to do some shows where we can have some oracle tarot readings and open up the phone lines to any callers. So for now, I'm going to be having these kind of discussion shows, and you'll see where we're going to be going with all this. Now, to get back on track, I want to talk next about how we can meditate with symbols, and that's a really huge topic, meditating with symbols. What we're doing when we're meditating with symbols is we first need to have some basic ideas to relate to these symbols. We can't just go and examine some symbol and try to get anywhere with it. we have to have some basic guidance in where to look for the meanings on this and what it represents. So we get that by reading the books and teachings that have been left down by the adepts in symbolism over the ages. And I'll be talking about what books we can read in some later shows. So the idea behind meditating with symbols is, first we have some basic ideas on what the symbols mean, and then we put the symbols together. We start making combinations, and we see how these combinations work to form thought forms that are harmonic with all the different types of symbols that are being combined. And this is what's going on in tarot with the combinations of so many symbols. What's actually happening is that we're using these symbols to kind of help construct a thought form that becomes stabilized through repeated meditations. Now, the way you do this symbol meditation is you form free association chains from these basic ideas that you studied, and it really helps to memorize them, because you don't want to be trying to look up meanings in a book if you're forming free association chains in a meditation. Now, you can't just let these free association chains go on forever. You have to bring them back to the starting point. And what that does is it anchors it and it stabilizes it so that it can be used for thought forms and how that's used in getting into these areas of consciousness. So what we do is we start with one idea, and we freely associate with that, and we see where it goes, we see where it takes us. And when we return to that starting idea, what we did is we closed a circle. And so the symbol that you want to keep in mind for how to meditate with symbols is this. It's the point in the circle. You have a circle and a point in the center. So the point in the center represents what the thing, whatever you're meditating on, it's your meditation topic, basically. And the circumference of the circle, going around the circle, represents this free association chain, and then when you come back to the starting point, that's the closing of the circle. So that's what you're trying to do in symbolic meditation, is start from any basic idea, and it really doesn't matter what, because once we go through these symbolic chains, we start to come across new wisdom, actually, when we do this. It's actually really interesting how it works. So just keep in mind the idea of when we're doing meditation with symbols, and if you want to do this after the show tonight, and you want to do a meditation with a symbol, do this. Pick a symbol to meditate on, and then you want to just kind of go into a relaxed state and calm your mind down a little bit, and be open to receiving new ideas, and kind of go into some deep breathing maybe if you do that, and then start with the basic idea on the symbol. Like, say if it's some astrology symbol, then you start with the basic idea on what that symbol means. And then you kind of freely associate with anything else that comes to mind that might be associated with that idea, and then you kind of see where it goes, but you don't just let it run out of control. You really do want to have a central theme and keep bringing it back and revolving around this central point. What happens is that slowly actually start to spiral in towards that central point, and that central point represents that transcendent state of consciousness that whatever symbol it is supposed to represent. And so this is occult symbols, where the symbols refer to states of consciousness. So that's how you can get into these states of consciousness, is by doing a kind of meditation like this, where you start spiraling in and honing in on this central point. Then you become perfectly identified with that central point, and new wisdom can start to flow through. And it's really the wisdom that flows through directly from the higher self. So we're going to be doing some meditations on this show, and if you keep that idea in mind, then you'll be set to go when we do that. So the way I work with symbols is mainly through the tarot. And the tarot is really the ultimate symbol language. It is the most complete and internally consistent symbolic architecture, you could almost call it, that has ever been created. I mean, it completely blows everything else away, what has been put down here in the tarot symbolism, when you understand what it really means and all the depth and layers that eventually peeled away show this incredible, just unbelievable knowledge that and wisdom that comes through. That is pretty much why I work with the tarot, and I'm going to be talking about how that process happens and how we can understand the tarot. So in terms of how I understand symbolism, it's mostly through the tarot. So when we get into future shows, we're going to be going a lot into tarot. So it's kind of good to get some basic ideas on the tarot out there. And really, when we understand that symbolism is the language of consciousness, and that our own symbolic web or network, or the net as it's called, is built out of these symbols, then we can start to understand this language through what's being shown in the tarot. And when we start to understand the tarot symbolism and how the basic symbols work, then we start to really understand symbolism in general. So tarot is amazing for what it is, but it's just great also that it can be used just for understanding the language of consciousness, just for understanding symbols. You don't really have to get into the deeper waters of tarot in order to use it for a little while in order to understand symbolism. If you want to use symbolism in any type of other work that you may be doing that uses that, you can sort of springboard that with tarot for a while, but you don't have to go all the way into tarot. However, if you do go all the way into tarot, you will find the most profound teachings that have really ever been set down. And it's interesting because when we start to understand this wisdom, this teaching, really start to see that all of it comes from within, that really the tarot doesn't put anything in us that's not already there. It sort of helps us bring out the wisdom that's already inside us. And so we're going to be talking on later shows about how we can use the tarot to help bring out this wisdom, and how this wisdom is exactly what we need to progress along whatever spiritual path our higher self has. Now, this higher self isn't something far off in a way. It's really right here and now. It's just that we're not normally attuned to the type of high vibrational consciousness and thoughts that our higher self is working with. So when we understand that the tarot is the language of subconsciousness, and we start being able to communicate with subconsciousness through tarot, we can actually start to communicate with the higher self through subconsciousness in this language that we get initiated into by studying tarot. So all this wisdom that comes forth from the higher self, it can only happen if you have established a way of communicating with subconsciousness, because the higher self can't speak directly to our ordinary consciousness. It can only do it through the medium, you could say, of subconsciousness, through having inspirations or dreams or visions, or hearing a inner teacher or inner guidance. Whatever it may be, we can only get there unless we have learned how to speak the language of our subconsciousness. And the best way of doing that is to use the tarot. So there are some other ideas on symbolism in terms of pure symbolism. So we talked a little bit about sacred geometry and the net and the masters of the net. And we will have some later shows that go into how we can use sacred geometry to heal our personal web or our net, because there's a deeper understanding that goes with this, and that is that our personal net has been constructed by nature up till now, sort of slowly working its way through by trial and error, and not really up to our conscious doing. So what we can actually do is take conscious control of how this net is constructed. Now, we don't actually construct the net. We have to feed patterns to our subconsciousness, and our subconsciousness uses those patterns to rebuild our net. And when we use these esoteric symbolism patterns like tarot and Kabbalah, we actually rebuild our consciousness according to these patterns. And these are the patterns of divine creation. So it's really, really great stuff to get into this and start to be a part of what's going on. Now, because subconsciousness is what constructs the net for us, it's sort of being programmed at a real basic level. What we can do is access higher levels of programming so that our net becomes constructed and programmed from a more perfect kind of pattern or thought form, and that is when we get into sacred geometry. Because when we internalize these sacred geometry patterns, they become higher level programs that can be used to rebuild our net according to a divine pattern in a much more perfect way. And it happens a lot faster. So sacred geometry is really about alchemy and how we can have an alchemical transformation from within by how these sacred geometric forms are responsible for the various processes of manifestation of thoughts down into the physical world. So we're going to look at sacred geometry in future shows, and then we're going to look at alchemy. And alchemy is probably the most baffling symbol language that has ever been devised. And we'll look at why this is, and what's the true meaning of alchemy, and how we can decipher the alchemical texts on the meaning of turning lead into gold, and the philosopher's stone, and the elixir of life, and what all these things mean. We'll see how we can perform the great work, and the great work is really how we become initiated into cosmic consciousness through our own inner development. So, the instructions for the great work are written in this alchemical symbolic language that's very, very hard and difficult to penetrate the inner meaning of it. But we can make this a lot easier. We can understand alchemy through tarot. And this is really a marvel when we can understand how alchemy works through tarot, because then we understand that everything in tarot is about alchemy. From the very beginning, when we're looking at tarot cards, we're really doing alchemy. So, that's where we're going with the show, and we've talked about some basics on symbolism tonight. There's going to be some future episodes coming up on some more of these topics that we've gone over, and specifically I have an idea on doing a show on how occult symbolism can be used in magic, and how we can use symbolism for magical transformations. Eventually we're going to do a show on doing alchemy with tarot and sacred geometry. That's going to come a little bit later, but you guys aren't going to want to miss that, because that's going to be a really important and intense show. So you're going to want to stick around until we get there and do that. But that's not all, because we're going to be going in depth into all of the major arcana of the tarot, which are the 22 main cards of the tarot. We're going to be doing an in-depth show on each of those, where we'll have a meditation live on the air where we can go into these levels of consciousness and explore this together on this show. And that's just going to be incredible and amazing. And I really can't wait until I'm ready to bring that out for you guys. So until then, I'm really glad to have been able to speak tonight on these topics, and it's something that is really interesting for me, and I hope that you have found all of this interesting. So, if you do like any of what we've been talking about tonight, then you're going to want to stick around and stay tuned with us here on Symbolic Sorcery. I'm your host, Symbolic Sorcerer, and I will see you later.